I trusted her more than anyone. I raised her with my own hands, stayed up through nights I thought would never end just to keep her safe. But that night, standing in the dark hallway of my own home, I heard her laugh at me. My daughter, my only child, laughing about how easy it would be to take everything from me. My house, my money, my dignity, planning to throw me in a nursing home and never look back. I froze, my heart breaking in ways I didn't even know were possible. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply you could never imagine they'd hurt you? Stay with me till the very end, and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply you could never imagine they'd hurt you? That's how I felt about my daughter. My only child. Rachel was my everything. And that's why even now I can't forget the way the words sliced through me that night in my own home. It was late, past midnight. I'd gone to bed early but couldn't sleep, my mind running through grocery lists and bills like it always did. So I got up to get a glass of water. As I stepped out of my bedroom, I heard voices drifting from the living room. Rachel's laugh, soft and sharp at the same time. Brian's deeper voice, low and smug. I stopped in the hallway, my hand on the wall to steady myself. I didn't mean to listen. I really didn't. But then I heard my name. And once I heard my name, I couldn't move. Brian said something about how much the house could fetch on the market. How we could finally take that vacation to Europe once they sold it. Rachel laughed and told him to stop counting his chickens just yet. Then she added that she'd already spoken to a place that could take me. A nice nursing home, she said, though the way she said it made my stomach turn. Brian chuckled and said it would be better for everyone, that I was just too forgetful now to live on my own. He actually called me useless. Like I wasn't standing right there. Like I didn't hear every single word. I pressed my back to the wall and clutched my robe closed. I felt my throat go dry, my chest tight, my ears burning. Rachel told him she couldn't wait to be rid of the old bat. Then she giggled like she'd told a joke. I stood frozen, trying to breathe, trying to tell myself I'd misheard. But I didn't. I heard them. Every cruel word. Every laugh. It's a strange thing when your heart breaks all at once and still somehow keeps beating. I felt hot tears sting my eyes, but I didn't make a sound. I didn't dare. I just stood there, my whole body shaking. She called me a burden. Said I'd had a good run. Said she deserved the house after everything she'd put up with. I thought of all the nights I stayed up with her feverish little body when she was sick. The times I worked double shifts just to afford her piano lessons. The birthdays I went without so she could have hers. And now here she was sitting in my living room laughing about locking me away. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for them to finish their drinks. Long enough to hear Brian say I probably wouldn't even notice I'd been moved. That's when my knees gave out a little and I had to grab the doorframe to stay upright. I wanted to burst in there and scream. To demand they explain themselves. But my voice wouldn't come. I couldn't find the words. So I turned and went back into my bedroom, quiet as a mouse. Shut the door and stood in the dark staring at nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard their laughter. You think you know the people you love? You think love means they'll never hurt you? But love doesn't stop a knife in your back. That night, I learned the hard way. And as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, one thought kept repeating in my head. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply you could never imagine they'd hurt you? Because I had, and they did. When I finally crawled into bed that night, I couldn't help but let my mind drift backward. I lay there in the dark, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan, and all I could see was her little face looking up at me. My Rachel. My baby girl. It almost hurt more than the words I'd just heard, remembering how much I'd given to her. I was only 29 when my husband died. A sudden heart attack on his way home from work. One phone call and everything I thought I could count on vanished. We just bought this house. Rachel was only 5. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that night, my hands clutching a cold coffee cup, wondering how in the world I was supposed to keep us afloat. But when she woke up and came shuffling down the hallway with her stuffed bunny, I wiped my eyes and put on my strongest smile. I promised myself I would never let her feel the weight of what had happened. From that day forward, everything I did was for her. I got a second job cleaning offices downtown at night after my shift at the grocery store. I'd come home long after she was asleep, my back aching and my hands raw from scrubbing floors. But seeing her happy and healthy made every long, lonely night worth it. There were plenty of months when I skipped my own meals to make sure she had what she needed. I never told her that. I never wanted her to know just how hard it was sometimes. I still remember her 6th birthday party. She wanted a princess theme. I worked overtime all week to afford the pink tablecloths, the little tiara, the bakery cake with white frosting and edible glitter. I spent half the night before blowing up balloons and taping streamers to the ceiling. The look on her face when she walked into the kitchen that morning made me forget every blister on my hands. She squealed and hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. That was all I needed. That smile. There were plenty of nights she was sick too. Nights I stayed up by her side with a cool rag on her forehead, whispering little stories until her fever broke. Once when she was 11, she caught a terrible case of pneumonia. I sat in that hospital chair for 2 whole nights, holding her hand, listening to the steady beep of the machines. The nurse kept telling me to go home and rest, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Every cough made my heart clench. Every moment she drifted into restless sleep, I would smooth her hair back and pray she'd wake up smiling. I worked so hard to make sure she never felt like she missed out on anything. I scrimped and saved so she could go to summer camp with her friends. I went without new shoes for years so she could have a proper prom dress. I still remember watching her walk down the stairs that night in that pale blue gown, her cheeks flushed with excitement. My heart swelled with pride and just a little bit of sadness knowing how fast she was growing up. Even the little moments meant everything to me. Sitting on the couch, watching cartoons together on Saturday mornings, packing her lunch with little notes tucked inside, braiding her hair before school, and laughing when she complained I pulled too hard. All of it felt like my reason for being. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched past breaking was worth it because she was happy. I told myself for years that I was lucky to have her. Lucky that she still came home for the holidays, even after she married Brian. Lucky that she would sit across from me at this same kitchen table, smiling and chatting about her life like nothing had changed. But now, lying there in the quiet, I couldn't help but feel a bitter taste in my mouth. Had she always thought of me as a burden, even back then when she hugged me and called me the best mom in the world? Was she already waiting for the day she could toss me aside? I thought about all the times she cried on my shoulder after a bad breakup, all the times she called me for advice about her job, all the times she swore I was her rock. And I wondered if any of it had ever been real. I thought love meant she'd always see what I gave up for her, that she'd always remember how hard I fought to give her the life she deserved. But now, hearing her laugh about shoving me into a nursing home, all I could feel was a hollow ache. I closed my eyes and tried to picture her as that little girl again, the one who used to hold my hand so tight walking to school, the one who used to crawl into my bed after a nightmare and tell me I made her feel safe, the one who used to tell me she wanted to grow up to be just like me. Somewhere along the way, I lost that little girl. And I didn't even notice. Now, staring into the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if all those sacrifices even mattered. Or if in the end, they just taught her that I was someone to take and take from until there was nothing left. I never thought I'd live to see the day she'd look at me and see nothing but a house to sell and a wallet to drain. But here I was. And the worst part was knowing that even now, even after everything, a part of me still loved her, still wanted her to look at me the way she used to, with wide eyes full of trust and love. But that little girl was gone, and all I had left were the memories of what I'd given her, and the bitter taste of what she'd become. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it so hard to see at first. The little cuts came quietly, almost gently, so I kept telling myself I was imagining things. It started with Rachel making little jokes about my memory. We'd be sitting at the table with neighbors or her friends, and she'd laugh as she told them about how I forgot my own doctor's appointment last week. Everyone would chuckle politely while my face burned hot, and I'd force a smile so no one could see how much it stung. A few days later, she caught me fumbling with my bank keys. I'd dropped them in my purse and couldn't find them right away. She snatched them from my hand with this look on her face, like she was dealing with a child, and said maybe it would be better if she kept them for me, so I wouldn't lose them. I nodded, even though something in my stomach tightened. Brian started dropping by more often after that. He'd linger in the kitchen asking questions about my bills or my mortgage. Once when I said I still liked writing checks instead of paying online, he rolled his eyes and told me it was time to join the 21st century. Then he took my checkbook and locked it in his desk without even asking. I kept telling myself they were just trying to help, that they meant well. But each time it felt like another piece of me being chipped away. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped me on the sidewalk. She tilted her head and asked if I was feeling all right, because she'd heard from Rachel that I was starting to get confused. She patted my hand the way you might a sick child and told me she and her husband would pray for me. I walked home with my chest tight, too embarrassed to even ask what else Rachel had been saying about me. At church, people started talking to me a little slower, like they thought I couldn't keep up. My bridge group stopped inviting me every Thursday. When I called to ask why, one of the ladies said they just thought I could use the rest. The rest from what she didn't say, but the way her voice softened at the end told me enough. Rachel kept moving my things around too. My favorite quilt disappeared from the back of the couch one day. My sewing box got shoved in the garage without a word. She rearranged the pantry so I couldn't find anything, and then sighed when I asked her where she'd put the sugar. Every little change made me feel like a stranger in my own home. Brian started answering my phone when it rang. Sometimes he'd talk to the caller as if I wasn't even in the room. Once I picked up to hear my old friend Margaret on the line. She said she'd tried calling me for weeks, but Rachel kept telling her I wasn't feeling up to visitors. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, staring at nothing. At night, lying in bed, I'd repeat to myself that I was still sharp, that I still had my wits about me. I made lists just to prove it. Grocery lists, birthdays, appointments, all written down neat and tidy. But even as I checked things off, there was this little voice whispering in the back of my mind that maybe they were right. I started to second-guess myself. I'd walk into a room and forget why and feel a wave of shame flush through me. I'd leave the stove on too long and see Rachel's eyes narrow when she noticed. Every mistake became proof in their eyes that I was slipping. One afternoon, I overheard Brian talking to a friend in the yard. He chuckled and said something about how tough it was dealing with someone who's losing it, but at least they'd have the house soon. My heart sank so low, I thought it would stop beating. I used to love my home. Every corner of it held a memory. The garden I'd planted myself, the kitchen where I baked Rachel's birthday cakes, the living room where she'd fallen asleep on my lap as a child. Now it felt like a cage closing in on me, each memory turning sour. The hardest part wasn't even the way they treated me. It was the way everyone else went along with it. The way neighbors and friends believed the stories, the way nobody thought to ask me if I was okay. I wanted to scream that I wasn't crazy, that I could still take care of myself. But I kept quiet. I kept quiet because I didn't know what else to do. Every time I opened my mouth, Rachel would cut me off, telling me not to get upset or not to overthink. Every time I tried to assert myself, Brian would give me that condescending smile and pat my shoulder like I was a child throwing a tantrum. So I stayed quiet and watched as little by little they took everything that made me feel like myself. My house, my friends, my pride. And somewhere deep down, I started to feel myself disappearing too. Like a shadow of the woman I used to be. But even then, even as the little cuts kept coming, I told myself I could bear it. That somehow, if I was patient and kept my head down, they'd remember who I really was. That the daughter I raised wouldn't really let me fall so far. But with each passing day, it got harder to believe there was any part of her left that still saw me as her mother. And harder still to shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this had been their plan all along. I didn't even understand where we were going until we pulled up to the tall glass building downtown. Rachel had called me that morning and told me to get dressed, nice saying we had an appointment to talk about some paperwork. I thought maybe she meant the bank or something simple, but when I saw the name on the door of the lawyer's office, my chest tightened. She walked ahead of me through the lobby with her head held high, Brian trailing behind her, and I followed because I didn't know what else to do. The receptionist looked up and gave a polite smile as she pointed us to a conference room down the hall. Rachel opened the door, and I stepped inside, my feet heavy like they didn't want to carry me any further. The lawyer stood as we entered, a man in a crisp suit with kind but distant eyes, and he shook my hand as if I was just another client. Rachel thanked him for making time for us and slipped into the chair at the head of the table as if it belonged to her. Brian sat beside her, adjusting his tie, and I lowered myself into the seat across from them, feeling already out of place. Rachel started speaking before the lawyer even had a chance to ask why we were there. She leaned forward, her tone calm, almost gentle, as she told him she and Brian were here to petition for full guardianship over me. My hands went cold as her words sank in. She explained without looking at me that I was no longer able to handle my affairs, that I forgot things, left bills unpaid, wandered off without remembering where I was. She even chuckled softly at one point, like it was all a little embarrassing, but inevitable. The lawyer nodded and took notes while Brian sat silently with his arms crossed, his mouth curled into the faintest smirk. I opened my mouth once, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, and I felt like the room was spinning. They talked about me like I wasn't even there, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be invisible. Rachel pulled out a folder from her purse and slid it across the table to the lawyer. Inside were notes she'd made, dates and anecdotes she claimed proved how far I'd slipped. She spoke about me with this pitying tone that cut deeper than anger, like I was something broken they had no choice but to take care of. I stared down at my hands in my lap, watching them tremble. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that I still remembered everything she used to love when she was little, the smell of her hair, when I tucked her into bed, the way she cried on her first day of school and clung to my hand. I remembered it all, every bit of it. But my voice stayed trapped inside me. The lawyer glanced at me a few times, as if checking to see if I would speak, but Rachel always filled the silence before I could. She told him she was just trying to do what was best for me, that she couldn't stand to see me decline like this without stepping in. Her words sounded so kind on the surface, but underneath, they were sharp enough to slice me open. I could feel my cheeks burning as the lawyer asked her a few questions about my health, my finances, my living situation. She answered every one of them with that same calm confidence, as though she'd rehearsed this 100 times. Brian finally spoke, then saying he'd already taken steps to handle my accounts and it would be a smooth transition. All the while, I sat there, quiet, humiliated, as if my own life no longer belonged to me. The lawyer kept writing things down, nodding, asking more questions, and Rachel kept talking over me like my opinion didn't matter anymore. At some point, I stopped hearing the words. The sound of her voice faded into a dull hum in the background, and all I could focus on was the weight in my chest. The heaviness of realizing my own daughter thought so little of me she'd strip away my dignity without even a second thought. I tried to meet her eyes once, but she wouldn't look at me. She just kept her gaze fixed on the lawyer, her hands folded neatly in front of her as if she was already signing my life away. Brian looked at me then, though. He met my eyes and smiled faintly, and in that moment, I hated him more than I thought I was capable of hating anyone. When the lawyer finally wrapped up and said he'd start drafting the petition, Rachel thanked him warmly and stood up. I stayed seated for a moment, unable to move my fingers gripping the edge of the chair so tightly they hurt. Then I followed her out of the room because I didn't know what else to do. In the car ride home, no one spoke. Rachel drove with both hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Brian scrolled through his phone. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing streets, my reflection faint in the glass. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. And in that quiet, as the city blurred by, all I could think was how strange it felt to be alive and yet feel like you didn't exist anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to quiet, so I wandered downstairs to make some tea. The house was dark and still except for the faint sound of voices coming from the living room. I froze in the kitchen doorway when I heard Rachel's laugh. It was soft but sharp, carrying just enough for me to catch the words that followed. She was telling Brian they couldn't waste any more time, that they had to act before I came back to my senses. The words sank in like ice water. Before I came back to my senses, as if all this time she'd been counting on me, slipping, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stood there gripping the counter, my heart pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. Brian answered her with a low murmur. I couldn't make out, but Rachel laughed again. That laugh cut deeper than anything else. There was no love in it, no guilt. Just a cruel sort of amusement, like she was proud of how clever she'd been. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound, and crept back upstairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, and by the time I shut my bedroom door behind me, my knees were shaking. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, too stunned to cry. It all made sense now. The way she'd planted little doubts about my memory in front of the neighbors. The way she'd let Brian handle my accounts and lock up my checkbook. The way she'd taken over my life one quiet piece at a time until I hardly recognized it anymore. She hadn't just stumbled into this. She'd planned it. She'd looked me in the eye for months, maybe years, smiling sweetly while she sharpened the knife she'd finally decided to use. And I'd been too blind to see it coming. I thought back to every moment I'd defended her in my own mind. Every time I told myself she was just stressed or worried about me. Every time I excused her coldness as something that would pass. I felt so foolish sitting there alone in the dark, realizing she had never once hesitated to hurt me if it meant getting what she wanted. The betrayal settled into my chest like a stone. Heavier with every breath, bitter and ugly and impossible to swallow. I thought of her as a little girl running to me with her arms outstretched, crying when she scraped her knee, giggling when I tickled her under the chin. How could that same child grow into this woman? How could someone I'd loved with every part of me look at me now as nothing more than an obstacle to clear away? It hurt more than I thought anything could. Knowing it wasn't just a moment of weakness or anger. It was deliberate, calculated. She'd been waiting for me to be weak enough to take advantage of. I sat there in silence for what felt like hours. The kind of silence that presses in from all sides, leaving no room for anything but pain. At some point, though, through the hurt, I felt something else start to stir. It was faint at first, but it was there. A small, stubborn ember of anger. Not the kind that burns out quickly, but the kind that smolders deep and quiet. I realized she thought I was too far gone to fight back. Too old, too tired, too broken to see what she was doing. And maybe that's what hurt most of all. That she thought she'd already won. I lay down, eventually staring up at the ceiling, my hands clasped tightly on my stomach. My heart still felt heavy, but the longer I stared into the dark, the more I began to feel that ember grow warmer. She didn't know me as well as she thought. For the first time in months, maybe years, my mind felt clear. Clear enough to see her for who she really was. Clear enough to know this wasn't the end of my story yet. My heart was broken, yes, but it was still beating. And as long as it was, I wasn't going to let her take everything from me without a fight. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet and still, and for the first time in weeks, my hands didn't shake when I got out of bed. I had cried enough. I had felt enough pain. Something inside me had shifted, and I knew now what I needed to do. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at my old address book. My fingers traced over the names and numbers, some of them faded, some of them crossed out, until they landed on one I hadn't called in years. Richard Geller. He'd been a friend of my husband, a sharp lawyer with a soft spot for underdogs. I hadn't seen him since his retirement party, but I had a feeling he'd take my call. When he answered, his voice was warm but curious. I told him everything, sparing no detail. The late night whispering the appointment at the lawyer's office, the way Rachel and Brian were circling me like vultures. There was a silence when I finished, then a quiet, measured response. He told me not to panic, that we had options, that I wasn't as powerless as they wanted me to believe. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Steady. Like my feet were planted firmly on the ground again. Richard gave me a list of things to do, and I promised him I'd get started that day. The first thing I did was make an appointment for a full psychological and cognitive evaluation. I wanted it done at a reputable clinic, not the quick little screening Rachel had dragged me to a few months ago. The doctor was kind and professional, and I cooperated with every test, every question, every memory exercise. When I left that office, I held my head high, knowing I'd soon have proof in writing that my mind was sharp and sound. Next, I bought a small digital recorder, one I could slip into my pocket without notice. From that day forward, whenever Rachel and Brian came near me, I turned it on. I kept my face blank, kept my voice quiet, let them say whatever they wanted in front of me. And they did. They didn't even try to hide it anymore. Rachel joked about how easy it was going to be to get me out of the house by summer. Brian muttered about how much the place would sell for. Every word burned to hear, but I smiled faintly and nodded along, letting them think I was slipping deeper into confusion. At night, I sat at my desk and copied everything down. Dates, times, exact words. Little by little, I built a file so thick it almost made me laugh. The kind of file a judge couldn't ignore. Then I went to the bank. I spoke to the manager privately, asked her to freeze my accounts and issue me a new set of checks and cards with a password only I knew. When she asked if something was wrong, I smiled faintly and told her it was just a precaution. When I walked out of that bank, I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, breathing in the cold Minneapolis air. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Rachel and Brian thought I was too far gone to notice what they were doing. But I saw everything now. At home, I went about my days quietly. I let them believe they'd already won. I let Rachel take over my bills and appointments. I let Brian hover over my shoulder as I wrote grocery lists, pretending to help me remember things. I even let them talk about me in front of the neighbors like I wasn't standing right there. But at night, in the privacy of my room, I sorted my papers into neat little piles and whispered to myself that I wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Each day I grew calmer, stronger. I started sleeping through the night again. The tears that used to come so easily no longer fell. My hands stopped trembling when I picked up the phone. My voice was steady when I spoke. I remembered who I was. For 76 years, I'd carried myself through worse than this. I'd buried a husband, raised a daughter alone, worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. I'd fought through grief and loneliness and exhaustion, and I never let myself break. I wasn't about to break now. I could see the end of this game already. I could see myself standing there in front of them, holding every piece of evidence I'd gathered, looking them both in the eye, as they realized just how wrong they'd been about me. That thought kept me warm on the coldest nights. I didn't know exactly when or how it would happen. But it would happen. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished. They had no idea who they were dealing with. By the time spring came, I had perfected my act. I moved slower. I let my words trail off sometimes, as though I'd forgotten what I was saying. I left little notes lying around with grocery lists and dates written down just enough to convince Rachel and Brian they didn't need to worry about me catching on. I even let Rachel scold me in front of the neighbors one afternoon when I fumbled a bag of flour at the store. I stood there staring at the floor while she shook her head and muttered that I just wasn't myself anymore. My cheeks burned, but I forced my lips into a small, sheepish smile, as though I believed her. At home, I made sure to nap in the middle of the day where they could see me. Some afternoons, I left the TV on, watching nothing in particular, just letting the sound fill the silence so they could walk past the living room and feel satisfied at the sight of me slumped in my chair. They thought they were winning. They thought I'd finally given up. I hid my recorder in a little velvet pouch in my pocket. Every time they came into the room, I slipped my hand into my pocket and pressed the button. I kept my voice low and let them talk over me. Let them say what they really thought when they thought I wasn't paying attention. It amazed me how casual they became about it all. One night, I stood just out of sight in the hallway while Rachel whispered to Brian that we'd need to hurry before I got worse and the house lost value. She laughed quietly and called me a burden. I pressed the recorder hard in my palm, feeling the weight of each word as it burned into my memory. Richard called every few days to check in. I told him everything. He told me to keep going, keep gathering, keep smiling at them like I didn't have a plan. So I did. Each morning I woke up and thought to myself, not yet. Every detail was falling into place. The documents Richard helped me file were ready. The evaluations from the doctors were sealed up tight in a folder in my dresser. Every bank statement, every slip of paper they tried to get me to sign, every word they said when they thought I wasn't sharp enough to notice was tucked neatly into the growing file. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror and have to turn away because I almost didn't recognize her. This fragile, quiet woman they saw was a lie I wore like a coat. Underneath, I felt sharper than I had in years. I even started playing little games with them, leaving my checkbook in the open to see how fast Brian would pocket it, pretending not to notice when Rachel carefully tucked my jewelry into her own suitcase when she thought I was asleep. Each time they took a little more, I smiled a little wider when I was alone. I knew the day would come soon enough. Every trap I set was pulling tighter, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. The thought of it filled me with a quiet kind of thrill, one I kept buried deep, so they would never see it. At night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, whispering to myself that it wouldn't be long now. They'd already dug their own hole. All I had to do was stand back and let them fall in. And when they did, I would be ready. The morning of the hearing, I woke before dawn and sat in the quiet, letting the stillness settle over me. My suit was already pressed and waiting, the papers carefully stacked in my bag, the recorder nestled on top like a final nail. I ran my fingers along the edge of the evidence folder and felt a calm resolve take hold stronger than the fear. Rachel and Brian arrived at the courthouse first. I could see them through the glass doors as I walked up the steps, their smug little smiles and whispered jokes carrying even into the hallway. They didn't notice me yet. They were too busy straightening their clothes and smoothing each other's pride, convinced today would seal their victory. When I finally stepped into the courtroom, heads turned. I saw Brian's grin falter when he caught sight of Richard walking beside me, his briefcase in hand, his sharp suit immaculate. Behind us, a pair of reporters and a photographer slipped in, quietly taking seats in the back. I kept my eyes forward, but couldn't help noticing the way Rachel's face tightened when the cameras flashed. The judge entered and everyone rose. My heart thudded hard in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Rachel and Brian moved quickly to their table, eager to begin, while I sat down slowly and let Richard handle the introductions. The judge glanced at me with polite curiosity, as if she'd already made up her mind about the fragile old woman sitting there. I almost smiled at that. Rachel spoke first. Her voice was smooth and polished as she explained how concerned they were for my well-being. She painted me as confused, forgetful, unable to manage my own affairs. She even dabbed at the corner of her eye for effect, talking about how hard it was to see her mother deteriorate. Brian nodded solemnly beside her, pretending to care. When she finished, the judge turned to Richard. He rose to his full height and began calmly laying out our side. He handed the judge the evaluation from my doctor, showing my full mental competence, signed and dated just 2 weeks ago. He presented statements from neighbors who'd overheard Rachel belittling me, mocking me, calling me a burden. I watched as Rachel's confidence began to crack. Her smile wavered, her hands fidgeted. Brian leaned in to whisper something, but she brushed him off, her cheeks flushing red. Then Richard played the recording. The words filled the silent courtroom, clear and cruel, Rachel laughing about how easy it would be to lock me away. Brian snickering about selling the house and dividing the money. The judge's expression darkened as the full weight of their scheme became undeniable. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, cameras clicking every few seconds. I didn't look at Rachel, not yet. I kept my gaze steady on the judge, letting the truth hang there in the air, undeniable and heavy. When Richard finished, the judge sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. She looked at me, and this time there was something different in her eyes. Respect, maybe. Or just the realization that she'd been wrong to assume weakness. Rachel tried to speak again, tried to stammer out some excuse about how it was all a misunderstanding. But the judge cut her off. Brian sank lower in his seat, his face pale. The reporters leaned forward, eager to catch every word. The judge ruled decisively in my favor, rejecting their petition for guardianship and ordering an investigation into their financial misconduct. As her gavel came down, I finally turned to look at Rachel. She froze when she met my eyes. For the first time in months, she didn't look smug or superior. She looked small. I stood as Richard gathered our things and the reporters swarmed closer, shouting questions. One of them asked how it felt to win. I stopped in the middle of the aisle, glanced back at Rachel and Brian, still sitting at their table, and spoke loud enough for the whole room to hear. Don't ever underestimate a mother. The flash of cameras lit up the room as I walked out, my head held high. Justice had been served, and I didn't even have to raise my voice. The fallout came fast. Within weeks of that hearing, Rachel and Brian's carefully constructed lives began to collapse around them. The court froze their accounts pending investigation and seized the proceeds from the accounts they'd already drained. Their names were splashed across the local papers' headlines, calling them greedy and heartless. Neighbors who once waved to them turned their backs. Even the pastor at their church asked them not to return for a while. I would sit at my kitchen table in the mornings, sipping my coffee and watch through the curtains as reporters staked out their driveway. Brian was fired from his job after his employer caught wind of the scandal. They didn't want a man who would con his own mother-in-law managing their books. Rachel tried to keep showing up at the boutique she managed, but customers stopped coming in, and the owner eventually let her go too. It was strange, watching her walk by my house one afternoon, shoulders slumped, sunglasses, hiding her face, pretending not to see me standing on the porch. I kept my home, of course. That was never really in question once the truth was out. The judge ordered full control of my accounts returned to me, along with restitution for what they'd already tried to take. It wasn't about the money anymore, though. Not for me. It was about proving to everyone, especially them, that I wasn't the frail little woman they thought they could erase. Rachel and Brian stopped coming around altogether. Their marriage didn't survive much longer. Neighbors told me about the shouting matches late into the night about Brian moving his things out 2 weeks later. One morning, I saw her car loaded with boxes, and then she was gone too, leaving the house they'd rented behind like a ghost town. The line I delivered that day in court followed me everywhere after that. Don't ever underestimate a mother. It made the rounds online, printed under my photo in the papers, even quoted on the evening news. Strangers stopped me in the grocery store to shake my hand, some of them with tears in their eyes, thanking me for standing up for myself. I didn't really mean for it to become a rallying cry, but it felt good. It felt right. Pride isn't something I ever gave myself much room to feel. But that morning, as I stood on my porch and breathed in the crisp Minneapolis air, I let myself feel it fully for the first time. They had taken so much from me already. My trust, my peace, my belief that family always meant loyalty. But they couldn't take who I was. The truth is, it still hurt. Every time I saw Rachel's face in my mind, I felt that old ache deep in my chest. There are no winners in a betrayal like that. But at least now she knew the answer to the question I'd asked myself in the dark of so many nights. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply you could never imagine they'd hurt you? She had. And she was wrong. I straightened my shoulders, walked back inside, and closed the door behind me. I sit here now, in the quiet of my living room, the house feeling bigger somehow, but not as empty as I thought it would. The storm has passed, though the air still hums with what it left behind. I think back to everything that happened, and I wonder if I'll ever stop asking myself how it came to this. Love is a powerful thing, but love, I've learned, doesn't mean closing your eyes to the truth. It doesn't mean letting someone walk all over you because you share blood or because you once held them in your arms and promised you'd never let anything hurt them. What I went through taught me that sometimes the person hurting you is the one you've spent your whole life protecting. And no matter how much it breaks your heart, you have to stand up. You have to protect yourself too. We grow up believing family is everything, that it's the one place you'll always be safe. But family can fail you just like anyone else. And when it does, you have to choose who you're going to be: broken or whole. For a long time, I thought standing up for myself meant giving up on her. I thought it meant I wasn't a good mother anymore. But now I know the opposite is true. Standing up for yourself is an act of love too, the kind of love you finally give yourself. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: love isn't blind. It sees the truth and faces it anyway, even when the truth hurts. Sometimes losing a child is how you find yourself again.